In this video I will explain to you how websites and web design works and how you can build a website yourself.
We start with a quick and simple explanation on how the internet works and what HTML is. Later on, we will look at JavaScript and go more in depth. In the end, we will build a project together. First off, HTML.
Your browser is a program that downloads instructions for pages from servers. These instructions are mostly written in HTML. They tell the browser what to display where. So HTML is a language that describes the layout and content to the browser, so the browser can display it as you intended. HTML has a little brother called CSS.
CSS, or cascading style sheets, is like the clothing and makeup for a web page. While HTML gives a website its structure, like the skeleton or bones, CSS makes it look good.
If you don't use CSS, for example to define the font of your header or paragraph, the browser has a standard font it will use instead. So if you want to make sure everything looks the way you intended, you need to use CSS alongside with HTML. Here are some very important HTML tags.
You can imagine a HTML file kind of like a text document. The document contains only texts, but some of these texts point to images, videos, or links that are usually stored on the same server as the HTML file. In essence, the HTML file is a list of content. What is written on the very top of the document is by default shown on the top of the page. But when we use CSS to style our website, we can make the order of elements on the page appear way differently. These are arrow brackets, and these are HTML tags. There are opening and closing tags. Everything in HTML has to be written between an opening and closing tag. Here's a text in HTML. To make the browser show it as text, it has to be between a P opening and closing tag. There are a few tags that don't have a closing tag. For example, if you wanted to insert a line break right here, we would use a single BR tag. Every HTML document starts with this line. It's also a non-closing tag. It tells the browser that what's about to come is HTML. Then we have a HTML opening and closing tag. Everything else is written between these two. Inside the brackets of the opening tag, we can also define the language in which our website is written. In our case, English. There are two parts of our document. The first one is head. Here we put everything that is not content, so things that are not directly visible on the site. The second one is body. Here we define all our content like texts, images, and buttons. Everything here is directly visible on the site. In our body, there is nothing right now. In our head part, we have three elements. The first one defines what set of characters we want to use. There are different ones depending on if you want to have a website in Latin or Arabic characters, for example. In our case, the character set we are using is UTF-8, which contains all commonly used characters. The second one just gives the browser some information about the dimensions of our site. The third one is the title of our site, which will appear in the browser's title bar. This is the basic starting point for any website you want to code. You could copy this anytime you start a new site.
And here's a quick overview of the syntax of CSS.
Code in CSS can either be stored as a CSS document file, or it can be contained within the HTML, in a dedicated area between these two style tags. Let's take our text from before. To style a HTML element with CSS, we have to select the element. Writing.p selects all elements of the type P, meaning all paragraph texts. Inside these curly brackets, we write all the changes we want to make. There are all kinds of these CSS properties, which all make different changes to different elements. On W3 Schools, you can find a whole list with all the properties you can change. But in most cases, you will just need a few, which you might be able to remember over time. But for now, don't be afraid to just look them up. In this video, we will just be looking at these few.
Next up, JavaScript.
While its name resembles Java due to a marketing decision, JavaScript has no relation to Java other than some superficial syntax similarities. Unlike HTML, which structures the content of a web page, JavaScript adds interactivity, logic, and dynamic functionality. For example, JS can create animations, update data without refreshing the page, or handle user inputs.
HTML provides the structure and semantics, CSS handles styling and layout, and JavaScript adds interactivity and logic. So what exactly can JavaScript do that HTML can't? Well, let's look at a real-life example. Dynamic forms. Imagine you're building an online quiz where the next answer depends on the previous question. For example, if the user selects yes to the question, do you own a car? Then the next question could be, what is the brand of your car? If the user selects no, then the question could be, do you use public transport? So how does JavaScript solve this?
Well, it uses dynamic rendering. JavaScript can listen to the user's input and instantly update the form by showing the appropriate follow-up question without reloading the page. Conditional logic. Using if statements or functions, JavaScript can decide what to display based on the user's choice. Data collection. It can track the user's answers in real time and send the final data to a server for analysis.
This dynamic behavior is impossible using only HTML and CSS, as they don't have the capability to react to users' input.
Without JavaScript, the page would need to refresh after every input, significantly impacting the user experience.
Next up, the DOM. The DOM, or Document Object Model, is a programming interface for web documents. It represents the structure of a web page in a tree-like format. The DOM represents HTML or XML documents as a tree of nodes. Each element, attribute, or piece of text in HTML is a node in this tree, so in a way they kind of work like folders.
So this snippet would look something like this in the DOM.
So every part in HTML documents, tags, attributes, and texts are represented by nodes in the DOM. The DOM allows developers to interact with the web page using JavaScript. Through the DOM, JavaScript can change the content of HTML documents, as in updating a text in a paragraph, modifying the structure by adding and removing elements, for example, inserting a new section into a web page, or dynamically changing styles, like changing the color or size of an element.
Interactive web pages. The DOM is essential for making web pages dynamic and interactive. Here's an example of manipulating the DOM with JavaScript. This code should find an element by its ID in our HTML and change its content. When a web page loads, the browser creates the DOM. When you say document, you're starting at the very top of this tree. The browser then searches down through this tree to find what you asked for, in our case, my element. It is telling the browser, look through the web page, find the element labeled my element, and then replace whatever is inside it with new content.
Without it, web pages would remain static after they initially loaded. By using the DOM, developers can update the page in response to user actions, such as clicking buttons, submitting forms, or scrolling. The DOM also matches for frameworks and libraries. JavaScript frameworks like React, for example, use a virtual DOM to manage updates more efficiently.
What are JavaScript frameworks? All a JavaScript framework is a new programming language with new features that is made out of JavaScript and converts whatever you wrote in the framework into plain JavaScript. Frameworks simplify the development process. They make your code shorter, easier to manage, and faster to write.
Frameworks are designed to follow industry best practices, which means they help ensure your code is written in a clean, consistent, and efficient way. This can be especially important for web development teams, as it helps everyone to work in the same structure and conventions, making collaboration smoother. So this was our quick overview of all things web design, and now let's build our own website.
All right, I'm now going to show you in simple steps how you can code a nice landing page like this one. Before we start, we need a code editor where we can write our code. There are the standard editors of Windows and Mac. And then there are specialized editors for programming, like Notepad++, Visual Studio Code, or NetBeans. You can download them from their respective websites. To start right away, you can use a web editor like CodePen. We are using Visual Studio Code in this video. First, we open the editor and put in our standard tags. This will be our starting point. Then we save the file with the ending of HTML. Let's find ourselves a hero image for our website. Bing Image Creator lets you generate AI images for free. This way, we never have to worry about any copyright issues. Let's make a website of a coffee shop. We type in our prompt. I like this one. Let's resize it into landscape and click download. We save the image in the same folder as our HTML file. Let's go into programming. So in our body, let's add our image. For that, we need an img tag. In order to tell the browser which file to use, we add a so-called attribute to the image tag inside the brackets. The attribute src stands for source and tells the name of the image. If we refresh our browser window, we can already see the image. To open your site in a browser, you can just drag and drop your HTML file onto your browser. Let's add some CSS. Again, HTML tells the browser what to display and in what order. CSS tells it how to display something. We can have all our CSS we will use separately in either a separate file or in our head, which again contains all things that are not displayed on the website. And CSS is not really displayed on the website itself. It is just telling the HTML elements how to look and behave. For this, we use the style opening and closing tag. Between these two tags, we can put all our CSS code. Let's make the image width the width of the browser window. In many cases, we define a size of an element with a pixel value. In our case, we will use % as our unit. Next, let's add a div container. This container is invisible, but it gives us great possibilities. For example, instead of having our image as an image file in HTML, we can give the container a background image. By typing in div and curly brackets between our style tags, we have now selected every div element in our HTML. In this case, we only have one. Then we add our image by saying background image, URL, and type in the name of our file. We give the container a width of 100% of the viewport width and the height 100% of the viewport height. To make the image fill out the entire div, we say background size, cover. Now we will add some text. To make a hero text, we type in H1. Between these two tags, we can add our text. Notice that we put our H1 inside the div container. This way, our text will be displayed on top of our hero image because the image is the background of our container. In our CSS, we select all H1 elements and give a certain styling. To choose a font, type in font family. In this case, we are going to use Poppins. We set the font size, and in this case, we will use viewport width as our unit again. This way, our text size is always in relation to the size of the browser window. So even if we resize the window, the text always fits. 3 is too small, 30 is too large, maybe 10 would fit. Yes, that looks nice. We give the text a color. The code editor already offers you some example colors. Let's choose this one. Or actually, let's just make it white. Let's turn our container into a flexbox. This will help us to perfectly center content in our div. There's much more to Flexbox in CSS, but for now, let's just say Flexbox is a very easy way to make elements automatically adjust their size and evenly distribute multiple elements. To center the text inside the div, we say justify content and align items center. Next, we go to our H1 text and center align it. We also add some padding so the text isn't too close to the sides of the div. Now let's delete these empty lines and add a paragraph. This is a standard size text in HTML. We put an open arrow bracket and type in P. Between the two tags, we put a sample text. As you can see, Display Flex made the two text blocks appear side by side instead of one below the other. The text is already visible next to our hero text, but we have to style it yet. Before we do that, let's maybe reduce the line height of the hero text a bit. We set it to 14% of the viewport height. Once again, in our CSS, we select all P elements from our page and define a font, size, and color. Let's just copy it from H1. We adjust the size to something more fitting. That looks already quite nice. Next, I'd like to make our background image a bit darker. For that, let's select the entire body of our HTML. We give it a dark background color. Next, in front of the URL of our background image, we type in linear gradient, then put opening and closing parentheses. And between them, we are giving two color values to create a subtle gradient. RGB stands for red, green, blue, and A stands for alpha or transparency. We are not giving any color values because we want the image to stay the same. We just want to make it a bit darker, so we add some transparency. If we set the fourth value to 1, the image is fully visible. If we set it to 0, it's completely transparent. Let's set them both at 50%. Oh wait, I forgot the dash between linear and gradient. I set one of the values at 20%. Now we have a nice subtle gradient and overall a much better contrast. Let's add an order button. For this, I'm creating another div element inside the first div. When I put the div below the H1 text and put the paragraph inside the container, it should appear side by side again, because the first div has display flex applied in the CSS. Now we can add a button inside the second div, so that it will appear below the paragraph. HTML has a tag named button. Inside, we put the text our button should contain. If we refresh the page, we notice something weird is happening. This is because in our CSS, we gave all diffs a background image. We need to tell CSS that it should only style one of the diffs that way. This is where CSS classes come into play. Inside the brackets of the first div, we type in class equals, and now we can give a name to this class. Let's give another class to the second diff. Name each one appropriately and in lowercase. In our CSS, instead of selecting every diff, we want to select only the class of hero image. We select classes by putting a dot, followed by the name. Everything else stays the same. The second diff with the name order doesn't need any styling for now, so we just don't select it and leave it as it is. By typing in button, we can add a style for all our buttons. Let's give it a text color and a background color. We give a padding of 12 pixels to the top and bottom and 24 pixels to left and right side, so the order text has enough space to the borders. As you can see, by default, the browser gives the button a border. Let's get rid of that by saying border, none. Let's give the button rounded corners to make it look more modern. We type in border radius and give a value of, let's say, 25 pixels. And well, you know, if you don't like the style or color of the button, just change it. You decide. Remember, we don't make mistakes, just happy little accidents. And we make the font of the button text bolder by saying font weight 800. Back in our HTML, we go inside the button's first bracket and type in onClick equals, double quotes, window.location.href equals. And now in single quotes, we would type in the name of the HTML file of another page if we had one. So if you would copy our current file, put it in the same directory and put in the name of the file, you could click on this button and get to another page. Lastly, let's make a header at the top of our website. In the HTML, we go to the top of our body and type in header in brackets. Between the two tags, we will put everything contained in our header. Let's make a nav bar. This would contain links to other pages. First, we add a placeholder for our logo. Later on, we could put an image file here as we did in the beginning, but for now, we just put a paragraph here. Type P and add a text. Let's give it the CSS class of logo. Well, actually, instead of class, we give it an ID. It's standard to use CSS ID for elements in the header and footer of a web page. That's because while classes can be used by multiple elements, IDs are unique to one element. With the A tag, we can link our own pages or external websites. Let's give this one the text Our Menu. Also, we give this a CSS class of button_nav. Let's add a few more links. Now in our CSS, we first give the nav bar a design. We make it a flex box as well, and to distribute the content evenly, we say justify content space between and align item center. We add a padding all around the element of 10 pixels, and on the top side, we additionally give a padding of 2. Now to our logo. Since it is not a class but an ID, we use a hashtag to select it. Now let's maybe give font size of 14 and make it bold. Okay, and for the navbar buttons, we want that if we hover over the link, the mouse is displayed as a pointer. So we say cursor pointer. Let's give a padding of 8 pixels to the top and bottom and 16 pixels to the sides. So there is a bigger distance between each link. And let's give them a color of white. Let's give the button elements a state, meaning that if we hover over them, they look different. We do so by saying buttons nav, colon, and then select the state we want to define. In this case, the hover state. We could change everything about this element here. In our case, when hovered on, we want it to have a different color. And once we got that set, the links change when hovering over them. Now we give all elements in the nav element a font of Poppins and a size of 12 pixels. Let's also add some simple JavaScript in here. We always put JavaScript on the very end of our HTML. That's because JavaScript files can often become pretty large, and all HTML elements would have to wait for the JavaScript to load. Also, JavaScript might be referencing HTML elements in its code, which would have not loaded yet. That could lead to problems. Instead of showing the "enjoy some coffee" text all at once, we want to create an animation that shows it letter by letter, like someone is typing it out in real time. JavaScript does this by first erasing all the text, then adding one letter at a time, waiting a tiny bit between each letter, and repeating that until all letters are shown. I will not go too much in depth. If you are interested in learning more about JavaScript, there are some great tutorials and resources linked in the description. Const text equals document query selector H1. This first line finds and selects the first H1 element on your page using the DOM, and then it stores it in a variable called text. This allows you to access and modify the H1 element. Const original text, text, inner text. This line saves whatever text was in the H1 into a variable called original text. If the H1 text changes later, original text will still have the old text. Text.inner text. This erases the H1 text completely. The text is now nothing. But in original text, the text is still saved. Let I equals 0. This creates a counter starting at 0 that we'll use to track which letter we're on. I is a variable with the value 0. Function typewriter. This creates a function that will handle adding each letter. If I original text length, this line checks if we still have letters left to add by checking if the variable I has been increased high enough to be bigger than the length, meaning the number of characters of the H1 text. If it is bigger, the function will no longer be executed. If functions loop again and again until the argument in the brackets is met, text inner HTML plus equals original text dot char at I. This adds the next letter to what's already shown. Char at I gets the letter at position I that is saved in original text. I++. Here we increase the variable by 1. Next time we loop through this function, I will be 1 instead of 0, which it is right now. And the line above this one will add the second letter saved in original text to the H1. So the number of letters in the H1 text keeps increasing. Set timeout. Typewriter 100. This waits 100 milliseconds or 0.1 seconds until it runs the function again. And this line starts the whole process by starting the function. Now when we reload the website, we can see our JavaScript animation. So this was our small landing page project. You could go on from here and explore many more possibilities to make your website prettier, more interactive, or engaging. The possibilities are endless. Thank you for watching. Feel free to check out our comparison of the best website builders in 2025. Houston out.
Marvelous.